Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks to all of you for being here this morning. My topic this morning is reckoning with race and reconciliation. And I've slightly adapted a service that I delivered at first at the end of September. And I began that by thinking about the word reckoning in and of itself. We've heard a lot lately in the headlines about reckoning with racism, reckoning with truth and reconciliation and that process. And I've been thinking about what it means to actually reckon with something. It means to take an accounting of, to come face to face with something that is challenging, to try to find a way to a solution. So reckoning with race and reconciliation. Talking about racism and reconciliation with Indigenous people is both simple and complex. Here's what's simple. The history of the treatment of Indigenous people and people of color is horrific. There is no denying or getting around the fact that it is a history full of terror and unequal treatment. One cannot look at residential schools and the 60s scoop and the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, or slavery and internment camps and on and see anything other than devastation. Devastation that did not have to be, and that was rooted in seeing the other, the non-white people, as less than, as people to be demeaned and used and controlled, as people who were not fully human, who needed to be controlled because they could not be seen as whole. The history is simple, simply horrific. Equally simple, at least I hope, is a vision for the future, a shared vision of full inclusion and equality, a future that is fair and multicultural and radically welcoming, a future in which all people are seen as part of a beloved community in which each of us has an equal role to play. What is complicated is the now, the present systemic wrongs that can be harder to see or name or pull apart. In some ways, this present systemic injustice can be hard to see, and in others, impossible to ignore. Big systems hold that horrific history that I just named in place. Education, healthcare, housing, justice and policing and the incarceration systems. These systems are not fair or equal. As just one single example, and I quote, Indigenous people are vastly overrepresented and make up a rising share in the Canadian prison system, making up 30% of the offender population in 2020, compared to 4.9% of the total population, end quote. Can it really be that Indigenous people in this country commit that much of a higher rate of crime? Or is there something wrong with the system that makes it so? The horrific history reverberates still. I didn't fully understand that until recently. The phrase intergenerational trauma made sense to me in the abstract. Intellectually, I understood what was meant when that phrase was used, that the past isn't just past, that current generations are still reeling and rebuilding from past hurts and losses. But I didn't quite fully understand emotionally what intergenerational trauma meant until this summer. I personally have been trying to come to grips with and learn more about my father and his childhood and his parents, my grandparents, ever since his death from COVID-19 on December 5th of last year. This summer, I was reading the extremely powerful book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson, when new insight unexpectedly arrived, both about my father and the Goodwin family legacy and about intergenerational trauma. In the book, Wilkerson recounts the harrowing and heartbreaking story of Will Brown. Will Brown's story was an all too common one of the time. A Black man lynched in public for a dubious, let's just admit it, likely invented crime for which there was no trial, no due process. He was simply put to death. Wilkerson recounts, and I quote, "As many as 15,000 people gathered on the courthouse square that day in September 1919. So many people that one cannot make out the faces in the human sea in a wide shot taken from above. These thousands of dots on a gelatin print were of one mind, had fused into an organism unto itself, intent on a single mission, not only to kill, but to humiliate, torture, and incinerate another human being." End quote. I will spare you the gory and awful details of how Will Brown died that day. Let's just say it was hard to read, and even harder to believe that people would and could and did do such a thing to another person more than once, again and again. Then, as I finished reading the story of Will Brown, one among many searingly powerful lynching stories in the book, I looked again at the date and the place. Slowly, very slowly, it dawned on me. My grandfather was born in Omaha, Nebraska, about 18 months before this lynching took place. My grandfather was a toddler whose parents, my great-grandparents, knew they were raising their son in the midst of terrorism. How must that have impacted them? How did it impact my grandfather growing up, and then my father after him? How might that terror, that fear of a world you knew to be openly hostile to your existence, shape your life? How could you ever feel safe? And how could you ever see the world as a fair place? I will never really know how Will Brown's death shaped my life. But as I put down the book, I was certain that it had. Intergenerational trauma. Precisely what our Indigenous neighbors are telling us they are still experiencing. The aftermath and the ramifications of colonialism, of residential schools, of the 60s scoop, of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, all the grief, all that lack of safety. The fact that so many reserves still don't have safe drinking water. How must they feel? We can, and we do, debate and discuss and wrangle words around this issue. Issues of racism and reconciliation. But what we can't do is debate someone's feelings or lived experience. If someone tells me that they are in pain, or that they don't feel safe, or that they feel they have been treated unfairly, it is my role to bear witness, to do what I can to advocate for change. Not to tell them that they are wrong or that their experience is incorrect. Because life experiences are neither right nor wrong, they simply are. They are real and true. And the question then is, what will we do with the raw material of experience? How will we? And will we allow it to guide us? I want you to hear me clearly say that none of this is about guilt or shame or blame. I'm not interested in making people feel bad. I'm not interested in making white people feel bad. As a mixed race person, half of my own identity is white, and I'm not interested in making that half of me feel bad. What I'm interested in is the fact, in fact, what I am counting on is that you also want fairness, that you also want the history of hatred to end, and for our systems to become more fair and more humane, to see all people as equally worthy and inherently possessing dignity. Our first principle couldn't be more true. Every person has inherent worth and dignity, dignity that cannot be taken away, dignity with which they were born. And yet, the problem is that our world doesn't act that way. And if we are being truly and deeply honest with ourselves, I think we can say that our Unitarian Universalist world doesn't yet act that way either. Because if it did, Unitarian Universalism would be a microcosm of our larger society, of the larger world in which we live and move. But it isn't. The Canadian Unitarian Council's Dismantling Racism Study Group report, which was just published this past May, found the following about the demographics of Unitarian Universalism in Canada. Survey respondents self-identified as 89% white, 3% Asian, 2% Black, and 2% Indigenous, with another 4% identifying as non-white, probably mixed race folks like myself and others. The most recent Canadian census, for which we have full data, 2016, identified the visible minority population of Canada as 22% of the population as a whole, double the percentage of Canadian UUs who identify that way. Going forward, the report recounts, and I quote, a 2017 Statistics Canada report forecasted that by 2036, an estimated 31 to 36% of the Canadian population will be Indigenous Black people of color. Indigenous Black or people of color. In other words, if we aren't open to change, to growth beyond our current demographics, Unitarian Universalism will go extinct. On the 27th of this month, in only a few weeks' time, the Canadian Unitarian Council will hold a vote on whether or not to adopt an eighth principle. For the sake of context, it is important to know that the principles have changed before, and there is a built-in process by which they are supposed to be reassessed regularly. They are not written in stone. They are not our version of scripture. They are guideposts to which we can add or subtract should we feel that some of our North Stars as a religious tradition have shifted in the 21st century. That what worked before is no longer sufficient or up to the present task which we find ourselves faced with. To my mind, as I've listened to people talk about the eighth principle, no one is saying the 7 current principles are bad or wrong, just not enough. Sometimes in our covenantal and aspirational tradition, we need to set new, clear, explicit aspirations and intentions for who we wish to become. Some goals, it seems to me we are saying, are too important to leave to chance. To my mind, the eighth principle is a way of saying and articulating the need to actively work against oppressions of all forms at the heart of what we do for the sake of our survival as a religious movement. And because we feel it is that we are ethically and morally called to do and to become a full beloved community at which all people have a place at the table of love and justice and belonging. Whether or not the eighth principle passes on November 27th, the work before us remains the same and remains clear. Embrace the possibility of becoming a changed Unitarian Universalist community or risk extinction. There's a parallel, I believe, actually, with the current conversations about climate collapse. It is no longer a debate about whether or not the planet will survive or whether we have to make changes in order for it to continue to be habitable. The science says we must change. In fact, the science says we should have changed a long time ago. Isn't that also true when you think about racism and all of the other oppressions that put some above others or value some lives more than others? Aren't we past due for change? Won't we go extinct as a religious tradition if we don't? The kind of change we're being asked to make is not a tinker around the edges kind of change. It's not a choose some different music every once in a while or offer a program here or there kind of change. It's more fundamental than that, more wholesale than that. Changes in decision-making and outreach and governance. It's an invitation to be together differently. And throughout all of this conversation, throughout the fall, there's been lots of resistance and reactivity. And I would guess that a lot of that is rooted in fear. Many of us don't like change, especially if we are unsure of what the outcome will be or where that change might lead. Especially if we really like things exactly as they are. But I want to invite us to look at this kind of change that's being proposed in a different way. What if instead of seeing it as something frightening, as something worrisome, we could look at it as something joyful, as a possibility that could be exciting? Unitarian Universalism is a wonderful tradition full of a fantastic set of values and beliefs. Why should I keep that to myself? Why wouldn't I want an ever more diverse community in which to explore what it means to be human and to share a planet? I think it's exciting. I don't want despair and fear to win. I want the struggles of my ancestors to have not been in vain. I want to create a community in which they would have felt welcomed and loved, not feared and despised. So let us do the work. Let us do the work of removing barriers to full inclusion for all people. Let us each explore it at whatever pace we need to, but in a way that feels meaningful. I implore you not to sit on the sidelines of this conversation. The Canadian Unitarian Council will continue to offer many conversations and forums even into the new year, regardless of the outcome of the vote on the 27th. And there will be lots and lots of conversations going forward about many of the isms that we face that keep us apart and keep us from becoming that fully beloved community that we would all wish to be. A final thought or two. I have been noticing in myself and wondering if it is true for others that what can get in the way is avoidance of conflict or the need to appear blameless. I used to be quite a conflict avoidant person, so I know what that looks like. I know how it feels. And yet, there are some things worth having some disagreements over. And I used to always want to look good or get things right. And I'm less concerned about that anymore. Because after I'm gone, I don't want it to be said of me that I never made any mistakes. I don't need people to feel as though I always looked like I knew what I was doing. Quite frankly, I would rather fail. I would rather look like a fool for what I believe. I would rather learn along the way. And I would much rather love bigger and more broadly than I do today. I believe in Unitarian Universalism. I have given my life to it. And I believe it is not a faith tradition that is only for those who have found it thus far, primarily white, well-educated, middle-class folks. I believe in my bones that it is a faith tradition for all people. So let us embody our principles, so that rather than being a denomination that is dying less slowly than others, we can become one that is thriving in extending its message and its love. May it be so. Blessed be. And amen.